What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video. And in case you missed the stream I held last night, the ETC11 tournament in Yugi-Kaiba just wrapped up the other day. So I figured now would be the perfect time to sort of, break down the results and talk about what I think this means for the Yugi-Kaiba meta going forward. But before we do that, we're at 920 subs right now, and I'd really like to reach 1,000 by the end of the year. So we're well on our way to making that milestone, and if you're not already subscribed, you can help us do so by subscribing. That will also keep you up to date on all the Retro Yu-Gi-Oh content that I release, and also my upcoming exploration into Breaker format, which should be a lot of fun. Also, if you enjoyed the video, as always, do leave a like down below, and also let me know what you think about my breakdown of these decks in the comments below. I love talking with y'all, as always. But with that out of the way, let's dive in to the results of this tournament. Now, I'll have a link to the format library coverage in the description of the video, as always. But for now, let's just talk about the deck type representation. So it should be no surprise to anyone that of the 26 people, the majority of the players in this tournament brought Soul Control. Soul Control is the most popular deck in Yugi-Kaiba, and it's widely thought to be one of the best decks in Yugi-Kaiba. Now, there is one other deck that, people think is on the same tier as Soul Control, and that's Stall Mill. And there were actually a number of people who brought it. I think 3 people brought it to the tournament. And Stall Mill was actually the deck that ended up winning the entire event. And this is not uncommon for Stall Mill to do. Like, Stall Mill has won a variety of events in the past as well. And it is a very strong deck. Basically, you just play more cards than your opponent in the main, wall up with the 2K Defenders and Ultimate Offering, and it can be very hard for your opponent to deal with that, at least in game 1. Going second and third in those games, you're able to actually side things in to, put up more of a fight. But then there are mind games to go into with that siding process and stuff like that. If you want to see sort of more of my breakdown on that, along with Ellie Tincan, who's one of the best players in this format, definitely check out the stream that we did for the finals, because we go deep into that sort of siding process, how to fight Stall Mill, things like that. But it's a very strong deck, although a lot of people don't like the play style, so it doesn't really see as much play as it probably would if there were sort of a more competitive scene for Yugi-Kaiba. Not to say that the scene right now isn't competitive, but if we had like a lot of players and a lot of people brought Stall Mill, then maybe things would be a little bit different than they are now. But Stall Mill won the event, but it was far from the only other deck besides Soul Control that was in the event. A fair amount of people brought Burn. I myself was one of them because Burn has a good matchup against Stall Mill. So I figured that, if I was going to encounter Stall Mill players, Burn would have a good matchup there. It also has a decent matchup against Soul Control. Like, I was able to win my first match of the tournament against Soul Control with the Burn deck. However, it does suffer against some of the more aggressive Ultimate Offering based decks. Things like Worm Burn, Umi Beat, things like that. And there were some people playing it. There were some people on Vanilla Beat, which is a variety of decks, basically just decks not playing Soul Control, and also just, playing a bunch of beaters and things like that. And so it's not stalling up. That's Vanilla Beat. Also, there was a Last World Turbo deck using Last World to cheat out monsters from the deck. Plays around Trap Hole a bit, and we'll actually discuss that Last World Turbo deck on the breakdown in the future, because it actually was a topping list, which is really cool to see. And lastly, Umi Beat, which is basically use Ubi to buff up Great White to 1800. That ties a lodge in, and it's very, very good if your opponent doesn't have any Great Whites in their deck as well. So that's the deck type sort of representation breakdown there. You can look at the deck category representation as well, and you can see that this format is pretty control focused. That's mainly where the best decks in the format lie, and that's part of the appeal of this format. That controlling nature, the grind nature of it, can be really, really fun and very unique from anything else in the game's history. So if you haven't played Yugi-Kaiba, I do encourage you to check it out, and the best way to check it out is probably to use one of the topping lists from this tournament. So let's dive into those now. So the first list that we have here is actually a Stall Mill list that I wanted to highlight, that made it to the top cut. It didn't actually win. It actually lost to the Stall player who actually ended up winning the event. But this is Clody's sort of 45 card Stall build. And it's interesting because a 45 card deck you'd think would have the edge in the mirror match, because you're less likely to deck out than your opponent if you're playing more cards than them. But card destructions can really even the playing field a little bit. And also, if you're playing 45 cards, it can be a bit harder to draw into things like Ultimate Offering, which are the cornerstones of your strategy. Although, then again, like if you're up against an opponent who's playing Stall Mill, you don't really need to worry about, dealing with aggressive pressure there. But there's some interesting things that they are playing in this list. They're playing a Login, which I guess can clear an opponent's beaters. Although I'm not really a big fan of Login in this sort of Stall Mill deck because you're just turning on your opponent's like trap holes or reinforcements or things like that. I mean, I guess your opponent wouldn't use a reinforcement on this, but you're definitely turning on their trap holes. And trap hole is a card that you kind of want your opponent to have dead the entire time, as it just clogs up their back row and makes their hand bigger for like card destruction plays. So I'm not like the biggest fan of some of the inclusions in the 45 card main deck, but I do think this is interesting. And I think like in the future, if you're bringing Stall Mill to a tournament and you're expecting a lot of other Stall Mill decks to be in the tournament, then this could be an interesting way to go with that sort of thing, as you're sort of just playing a deck that's slightly advantaged in the mirror match, I think. But it did lose the mirror to DK's Stall Mill build. So, that's good to keep in mind as well. Maybe the strategy is not actually the best for that mirror match because, based on the results of this tournament, it did not really pan out for Clody here. Although very interesting to see. The next deck I want to talk about is Dramatur's sort of Last Will Turbo deck. You could call it Last Will Turbo, you could call it like Worm Burn, I guess. But this is a very, very interesting deck regardless. And sort of an interesting conglomeration of a couple different ideas. So when I explored Yugi-Kaiba format, I sort of put a lot of focus on this sort of worm control sort of strategy, which is just using the Wicked Worm Beast in conjunction with things like Ultimate Offering to just get in consistent damage and prevent your opponent from actually being able to clear Worm Beast or clear, other cards on your field, and just giving you constant aggressive pressure. And there was also a deck running around Last Will Turbo, which is basically using Last Will to turbo out monsters from the deck. It plays around things like Trap Hole a bit, allowing you to continue the aggression on that front, and can even get like defenders as well. And it looks like Dramaturg has combined both of those concepts into a 43 card deck, which is really interesting. Now, 43 cards may seem weird here, but if you're playing 3 Last Wills, then I kind of get it, right? Because you don't necessarily need to draw into a bunch of your monsters because you can search them out from the deck. And if you draw too many of your monsters with under 1500 attack, then the Last Wills can be dead later on. So I kind of get the 43 cards. Not sure if that's the way to go or not, but it is an interesting sort of way to do it. And also in the Stall Mill match, having the 43 cards can potentially help. Although with card destruction and with the Worm Beast playing into card destruction a little bit, I'm not really sure this deck can deal with the Stall Mill matchup that well at all. But that's what the side deck is for. And you can see the Dramaturg's got a pretty stacked side deck. Summon Skulls, Judge Men, and Soul Exchanges as well. And also Triple Okazi as well for the burn angle too. So very, very neat deck. I think this is the natural evolution of a bunch of decks that were running around the format. And while it does sort of fall prey to one of the best decks in the format, which is Stall Mill, it did well enough in this tournament to show that this deck potentially does have legs. So I'm looking forward to seeing more people experiment with this strategy in the future. And of course, diving in to the top 2 decks in this tournament, we've got Danny Droid's Soul Control list, which got second place in the tournament. You can watch the finals game between Danny and DK. And you can see it was actually a pretty close match, which is really cool to see, and shows the power of Soul Control. While Stall Mill may be a dominant deck in this format, Soul Control is very well equipped to deal with it. And also can go even more heavy on the Soul Control aspect in games 2 and 3, bringing in another Soul Exchange. And you can see here Danny has both copies of Judge Man here. And that's kind of interesting because you're playing basically 3 Soul Exchange, 1 Change of Heart that converts to 4 Tribute Summons, and this can go into 5 Tribute Monsters. But the Tribute Monsters are really good at just dealing with the 2K defenders and stuff. And oftentimes, if your opponent has used up a lot of removal to clear your other Tribute Monsters, then you can just stick a Tribute Monster on field, keep hitting in to their defenders, and get through to their life points that way. So I do like that strat in this deck. And also you can see the burn package here, Triple Okazi, Double Justicers, that can also be really powerful against a Stall Mill player. But other than that, it's pretty standard Soul Control. You see only 1 copy of Sorcerer. Oh no, there's 2. They're just in weird places. Not really sure why it turned out that way. But yeah. So yeah, not really too much to talk about. There's one Wicked Worm Beast in the main deck, as well as one Wall of Illusion, which are kind of neat inclusions. But I think ultimately this is like a pretty standard list, and it shows that like the standard sort of soul control deck in Yugi-Kaiba has been pretty solidified in this sort of thing. It's very, very good at dealing with a wide variety of decks. Now, I think there are places for this deck to grow in the future. I think this will largely come for what I mentioned earlier in the video with more people joining the format and more people playing. Because, as of now, when you join a tournament, you can expect there to be very, very little people playing Stall Mill. Because Stall Mill is a very powerful deck, but as I mentioned earlier, not many people like to play it. So that means that, you're not necessarily going to, prepare in the main for Stall Mill as much as some of the other more aggressive decks running around because, basically every measure you take towards stopping Stall Mill, then weakens your deck towards things like, Vanilla Beach or Yo Aggro or things like that. So I think that it kind of makes sense that the deck looks like this right now, given the meta matchup in each format. But I think that it would be really cool as time goes by and more tournaments happen to see more people playing Stall Mill and seeing how the Soul Control deck adapts to that. And I do think that the Soul Control deck can have a pretty decent matchup against Stall Mill in game one, even if it just sort of prepares for that beforehand. And I hope that we eventually get to a point where the Soul Control deck will be able to do that beforehand and thus will make for a more sort of vibrant meta, I think. Just more back and forth between the Soul Control and Stall Mill decks. Makes Stall Mill a bit less of an easy pick to bring to these tournaments if you don't actually care about the playstyle and you just want to win. And so I hope that we see that develop in the future. But, I've been talking a lot about Stall Mill. I showed off a sort of out there version of Stall Mill. Let's dive in to the topping Stall Mill list from this tournament and see what that looks like, because I do think it probably is sort of the perfect form of Stall Mill that you can play as of now in this format. So here is DK0's topping Stall Mill list. And, DK0 has been playing this deck for a very long time. They put a lot of work in this, experimented with a variety of things with the deck, and this is their sort of final build that they've come to. And I think this list is almost perfect for the metagame as it exists right now. As I mentioned in covering Danny's deck, I do think that there are ways for Soul Control and other decks in the format to sort of pre-side against Stall Mill, and maybe if those sort of pre-siding strategies become popular, this deck will shift up a little bit. But if you're going in to duels and you have the read that your opponent is not going to be like heavily prepared for Stall Mill in the main deck, then this deck can just take games left and right. And it is just so powerful. I mean, look at all the 2K defenders in the Walls of Illusions as well, the Man Eater Bugs. Like, every non-tribute summonable monster is here just to, wall up or pop your opponent's stuff. And the Gyakuten Megamis pair perfectly with double Soul Exchange, one Change of Heart. Everything else here is focused on, just, removal, like Fissures and Raigeki and Dark Hole and stuff. Getting back a wall in the form of Reborn. Pot of Greed to draw into your stuff that you need, because occasionally you do need to draw deep to get to the ultimate offerings, which is the backbone of your plan. Swords to stall out even longer, and of course the card Destruction to sort of put the final nail in the coffin, and occasionally just finish your opponents off with this. So I think this is probably the perfect Stall Mill main deck that you can play. I think the side deck, it's very, very good here because, it transitions basically into a more aggressive deck. And I think that's smart. But I do think that maybe in the side, some changes could be made. I mentioned this in the stream, but I think maybe going for like a more worm control strat could be good, because a lot of the siding against Stall Mill decks like relies on going more heavily into a soul control strategy, or even going into something like burn. And I think that Wicked Worm Beast actually plays well against both those sorts of decks. So I think that maybe going more heavily into Wicked Worm Beast in the side deck could be good in the future. And we actually saw in Game 3 of the finals match that Wicked Worm Beast really carried that game. So I'm curious to see if that will be a change that takes place in the side deck in the future. But as I said, if you're planning on playing Stall Mill, is pretty much the perfect build that you can pick up here. This deck is so optimized, so powerful, and I expect to see a lot more people playing it in the future. But what do you all think about the results of this tournament and what it means for the Yugi-Kaiba metagame in the future? Do you think that Stallmill's dominance is sort of just, something that ruins the format? Or do you think that it actually can open the door to a more vibrant metagame in the future? I always love talking with y'all and discussing this sort of thing in the comments down below, so let me know what you think. And I hope that you enjoyed this video as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.